So, the Seattle Kraken only play the Toronto Maple Leafs twice a year, but here in their first ever season, they've managed to lose to them 3 times. What's cracking, everybody, and welcome to the first ever Kraken trade deadline, I guess. I mean, it seems like Ron Francis may have misunderstood when the deadline day was, trading away what seems like half the roster on Sunday, with still a day left to, well, maybe move a couple more guys. Now, I'm still going to do a whole big picture look at the trade deadline for the Kraken once Monday has come and gone, even if there aren't any more trades that the Kraken do, which, based on how Sunday went, I'm not entirely convinced that Ron Francis is done. That having been said, I wanted to get out a quick reaction to what originally was just going to be the Gio and Blackwell trade, but late on Sunday, Ron Francis adds a couple of more, dealing Lauzon and Appleton in separate deals. But first, the big one, and that of course would be the Kraken sending Mark Giordano and Colin Blackwell to the Toronto Maple Leafs in exchange for a 2022 second round pick, a 2023 second round pick, and a 2024 third round pick. So in all, it's 2 second round picks and a third for Gio and Blackwell. First things first, even though we have known for quite a while now that Gio probably was going to end up getting traded here at the deadline, and even coming into the season, we knew there was a pretty decent chance that it might just be one season that he spends in Seattle. Having him a part of this team for this first season and being the first ever captain in team history has been an absolute awesome experience to have a player that's that good, or at least has that much of a history playing for Seattle in their inaugural season. And with that, it definitely does suck at least a little bit to see him leave. Again, even though we knew it was coming. Now, my initial reaction to this trade when it was officially announced and fully finalized, which did take quite a while after we heard first that Gio was going to the Maple Leafs, there was a whole couple of hour roller coaster there of fake reports, and then Blackwell eventually getting added to it later on, and then it was there isn't a first involved, then it was there's 2 seconds, and then finally the final deal. Regardless, my initial reaction when seeing that final deal was, well, let's just say it wasn't a particularly favorable reaction on the Kraken side of things. Honestly, it was almost like expansion draft day all over again, where back on expansion draft day, I kept expecting over the next day that we would see the announcement of some side deals that the Kraken had made, even though there were reports that none had actually been made. And now with this trade, considering all the buildup there was to it, with us knowing for one thing that Gio was gonna get traded for a couple of weeks, and then on the day itself, with all of the different pieces of this that were added to it over time, again, Blackwell, and then how the different picks were coming in, I really kept expecting there to be more added to it even after the official last deal was announced. I didn't really accept that that was the full deal until the Kraken themselves put it out on Twitter. And really, that just comes down to the fact that with the trade being what it was in the end, it just doesn't seem like the Kraken got anywhere near enough for Blackwell and Giordano. 2 seconds and a third is a decent return, or I would have thought would have been a decent return for Gio alone, but to throw Blackwell in there, I know to non-Kraken fans that really probably doesn't seem like much of an ad, but for the Kraken, he has been a crucial part of the best line that they've had going on the forward end for about a month now, and has been definitely one of the more energetic and hardworking players the Kraken have had on the forward end, driving a lot of the offense that they've had when there actually has been offense anyway. Not to mention the fact that on the penalty kill, the combination of Blackwell and Gord has been absolutely lethal shorthanded, scoring on at least 3 different occasions, and have had all sorts of opportunities even outside of those shorthanded goals that they have managed to score on. So to lose him and the captain in a single trade and not even get a first round pick back, yeah, that definitely stung quite a bit. Now, since that first initial reaction to this trade, which was probably somewhat exaggerated in my head by the fact that I haven't been running on that much sleep over the last couple of days, I have come down off the cliff a little bit, where I was starting to really doubt Ron Francis's ability to make decent trades, even after we saw him probably get the better of the Flames with that Yarncroke trade. And we'll get to how that plays into this in a second. In a vacuum, 2 seconds and a third for Gio and Blackwell really isn't all that bad. In fact, it's honestly a pretty good trade for the Kraken, considering they're not going to the playoffs anyway, so they're not going to need either one of those players going forward. And both of them are on expiring contracts, so if you're not going to re-sign either one in the offseason, you might as well get something rather than nothing and just losing them a month later anyway. Now, I'm not necessarily buying into the whole Gio's a 38-year-old defenseman who's had one of the worst seasons of his career, so he's not worth anything argument that I have seen some people making. Sure, it's probably true that Gio's down season for the Kraken and the fact that, again, yeah, he is 38 probably does play a pretty big role in why he doesn't get a first round pick, while a guy like Sherratt, who's 30, did get a first round pick from Florida. But still, he is quite valuable to the team as far as a leadership standpoint at the very least, and has been pretty good for the most part defensively, especially in the back half of the season once the team started to come together at least a little bit more anyway. But if you do want to look at the trade as the Kraken getting 2 seconds for Gio and then a third for Blackwell, again, it's not really all that bad of a trade as far as the value for those players. I do think that Blackwell probably had more value to the Kraken than a third round pick, especially if they were to sign him going on to the future and keep that line together, which obviously didn't end up happening the way the night ended up going. But if Blackwell was going to get traded, a third round pick's probably the best Seattle could have expected. Now, in reality, what I think probably is more likely that ended up happening was after the Kraken gave up on trying to get a first for Gio, they went for 2 seconds, and Toronto still didn't really want to give up 2 seconds for just Gio, so they asked the Kraken to kick something else in, which ends up being Blackwell. But Blackwell and Gio for 2 seconds is definitely not a fair trade, so then the third gets kicked in to cover the extra cost of Blackwell. Though, I suppose it doesn't really matter all that much how it ends up happening in the long run, but still. It is definitely also worth mentioning that there's kind of an exchange of intangibles in this trade as well, even just as far as Gio is concerned. For one, even if Gio might not offer as much on the ice as he once did in his career, he does still offer quite a bit when it comes to veteran leadership and presence in a locker room that does make a pretty big difference, and certainly made a big difference in Seattle in their first season, even if that didn't necessarily lead to wins. And it might not have huge value, but that still does have some value when you're thinking about trading a player. As far as what Seattle gets in return, well, it's not so much something that Toronto gives them as something that they just get from trading with Toronto. And that's the fact that since this is the destination Gio wanted to go, going back to his hometown, which is pretty cool, that fact that Seattle was willing to work with a veteran player like Gio to get him to the place he wanted to go via trade, even though there were other teams interested, does earn a good reputation for Ron Francis specifically as the GM, especially among veteran players, that if they come to Seattle and if they do end up getting traded out of Seattle at some point, Francis is willing to work with them to potentially get them to a place that they want to go, even if they don't have a no move or no trade clause. It still does make some amount of difference and is something that players would look at when deciding where they would want to go, for example, in free agency. Plus, I would say it's better than having, say, a reputation like Vegas, where even though they might be a winning team, and that definitely is attractive, they also now have a reputation, especially with what they did to Marc-Andre Fleury, of being a bit cutthroat and sometimes even dishonest, just doing whatever is best for the team, regardless of what's best for the player, even if it is a guy like Marc-Andre Fleury, or Gio in this case. The problem that I do still have with this trade, though, is that while, like we just said, in a vacuum it might not be all that bad of a deal for Seattle, the fact is it isn't in a vacuum, and there are other deals, even one from Seattle before this, that give a little bit more context and definitely make this look, at the very least, a much more underwhelming return that Seattle gets compared to some of those other deals. The one that a lot of people around the league seem to want to compare to right away was the Ben Sherratt deal, which in some ways I guess makes sense considering they're the two biggest named defensemen that were going to be on the move here at the trade deadline, where Sherratt ends up getting the Canadiens back a first round pick in 2023, a fourth round pick in this year's draft, and a 20-year-old former third-round pick in Ty Smilanic. Now, sure, if you believe that Sherratt and Gio were worth the same thing on the trade market, then yeah, when you compare these two trades, Seattle absolutely got the worst deal, especially considering they also again throw in Blackwell. But I have to say I think Sherratt was just worth that much more than Gio. For one, he's 8 years younger, which does allow the Panthers the opportunity to sign him into the future and extend him before the offseason, if they want to keep him as a part of the team, not to mention the fact that the current deal that he's on is much cheaper than the one that Gio's on, which does afford them the extra flexibility in figuring out how to fit him into the cap space for this season. But if you do want to look for a trade that is much more comparable, at least as far as the return is concerned, you don't have to look any farther than the first trade that the Kraken made during this trade deadline season when they sent Järnkrok to the Flames, where in exchange for Järnkrok, the Kraken were able to get back a 2022 second, a 2023 third, and a 2024 seventh. So not quite the exact same return, but it still is a second and a third round pick that both trades get back for the Kraken. And then the Gio and Blackwell trade gets them a second rather than the seventh that Järnkrok got. So basically then what this is saying is that Gio and Blackwell were only worth the difference over Järnkrok of a second round pick over a seventh rounder. And it's also worth mentioning with this comparison between the Järnkrok and Gio trade that with the Järnkrok trade, that seventh round pick that the Kraken end up getting back as well thrown in at the end was thrown in, it sounds like, as a compensation for the Kraken retaining some of Järnkrok's remaining cap hit, which really wasn't all that big, and certainly wasn't that big compared to the retention that the Kraken have on the Gio contract, with the Kraken again retaining half of Gio's remaining salary, which doesn't really make a huge difference to Seattle specifically, as it is just for this season, and they have plenty of cap space for the rest of this year. And again, that retained cap space isn't going to make a difference next season. But still, getting that seventh back for retaining that little bit of cap space on Järnkrok really makes you wonder what the Kraken got in return for retaining the significantly more cap space of Gio, where honestly it kind of seems like they just did it as a favor to the Leafs, which is not really the type of business you want to be doing, even if it does maybe help you with your reputation with that team going forward and maybe make them a little bit more likely to trade with you in the future, which might sound like kind of a dumb thing, but that is kind of how the world of GMs works. At least with some of them anyway. Now, to be fair, as I mentioned earlier, that Järnkrok trade was a surprisingly good return for the Kraken, and a trade that I have to say I think the Kraken probably got the better of even early on here without knowing what those picks end up being or what Järnkrok's going to do for the Flames. But still, it really does make this return that the Kraken get for Gio and Blackwell, well, just worse. The bright side, I guess, is that as a body of work with those two trades combined, the Kraken getting 6 picks back for 3 players, 3 of those being second round picks and 2 of them being thirds, is a pretty good return and probably better than I maybe would have expected, though I still would have hoped for a first from whatever the Gio trade was. Now, for those of you who are just disappointed by this Gio Blackwell trade for the sole reason that it means that Blackwell is leaving and splitting up that Blackwell Appleton Gord line, which to some extent I'm right there with you, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that there still is very much a chance that the Kraken could end up signing Blackwell right back in free agency, and he could rejoin the team next season. The bad news, though, is that I don't think that that's terribly likely to happen. Well, I do think it's fairly unlikely that the Leafs would extend Blackwell or re-sign him before free agency to a new contract. I just don't necessarily see Seattle going after Blackwell in free agency. Now, if they miss on some of their other targets in free agency and Blackwell's still available, then sure, the familiarity with the team is there and there is an outside chance that it could happen, but I really don't necessarily see that as the most likely outcome. So unfortunately, even in spite of how fun Blackwell's been to watch over this last month and all the energy that he's brought to the bench and out on the ice, I think we have seen him play his last game in Seattle. At least for the Kraken anyway. Plus, with Blackwell already gone and that line now having been split up, it definitely opened up a little bit more of a possibility that Appleton, who was set to be an RFA at the end of the season, could also get moved before the trade deadline came and went. And sure enough, it didn't even end up taking until Monday for Appleton to also end up getting traded out of Seattle, as he goes right back to the Winnipeg Jets, who the Kraken got him from in the expansion draft, in exchange for a 4th round pick. And I have to say, this is another one that really seems like the Kraken sold low on Appleton and could have gotten a lot more out of him, either on the ice as a part of the team going forward, or trading him somewhere else for a 3rd round pick or maybe a 2nd round pick. And I know a 2nd round pick probably sounds really optimistic in exchange for Appleton with how his season is gone, but as we'll see later, it might not have been necessarily out of the question considering what the Kraken were also able to pull off outside of these guys. With the Appleton trade though, this is definitely one that hurt me a little bit more. For whatever reason, Appleton was a guy that I had a bit of a soft spot for, was one of my favorite players the Kraken got in the expansion draft. Unfortunately, he didn't really end up producing for the Kraken nearly at the level that I was kind of thinking he could. So it's not terribly surprising that the Kraken didn't see him as a core piece going forward and decide to just get something for him rather than letting him walk in free agency. Still though, a name like Appleton just seemed perfectly suited for the state of Washington, and at least for me, the fact that he was a redhead certainly didn't hurt either. Now, as far as that reason for why I said a second for Appleton may not have been fully out of the question if the Kraken had continued to shop him, that's because the last trade that the Kraken made on Sunday was in exchange for a second round pick, and it was Jeremy Lauzon that ends up going to the Predators for that second rounder, which in just all sorts of ways is an incredibly surprising trade. For one, the Predators really didn't seem like a team that needed that much help on defense, and certainly not enough that they're willing to pay a second round pick for a depth defenseman. Now, it's entirely possible, and I would say probably even likely, that with Nashville having a bit of a reputation for being good at developing defensemen, and Lauzon being a relatively young player, they probably look at this as less of a rental player with Lauzon being an RFA at the end of the season, and more of a guy that they're looking to be a part of their team going forward, at least somewhere in that second or third pairing. Even if that is the case though, a second rounder for Lauzon seems like quite a bit of an overpayment by the Preds. As a Kraken fan, I'll happily take that return. But yeah, I gotta say I did not see this one coming in any shape, way, or form. And that's also coming from someone who really did think that Lauzon gave the Kraken a lot more than a lot of people in the Kraken fanbase gave him credit for, where there's a good chunk of the Kraken fanbase that was happy to see Lauzon go for any return whatsoever. And the fact that they got a second out of him, I think made up in a lot of people's eyes for the disappointing return for Gio and Blackwell. For me, sure, Lauzon did make a number of defensive errors, especially early on in the season, which got him a bit in the doghouse and kind of used as a scapegoat a lot of the time, which, as the season went on, I thought was somewhat unwarranted and went a little bit over the top, as he did offer very good physical play, and honestly, I really did think Lauzon was one of the most improved players on the Kraken roster from the start of the season to at least this point in the year, and considering he's a young player on the defensive end, I wasn't overly worried about his future with the Kraken going forward. That having been said, the Kraken certainly don't have issues with depth on the defensive end, and if they can get a second round pick out of a guy like Lauzon, then yeah, you might as well jump on it. All in all then, by the end of the day, as I'm recording this Sunday night, with still Monday where more could happen for the Kraken, they currently are sitting on 32 picks over the next 3 seasons, with 8 picks in the second round and 5 in the third round. With 7 of those 8 second round picks coming in the next 2 drafts, which are both supposed to be pretty deep drafts, and 4 of them coming in this year's draft, which is maybe even the deeper of the 2. Which does mean the Kraken will, at this point, own an 1/8 of the second round in this year's entry draft, which will make that pretty fun to watch. And regardless of what you think of Ron Francis as a GM and his trading abilities in the NHL, especially over these last couple of weeks and today in particular, he does have a very good historical track record of drafting, especially in the second and third round. So that's some pretty good news for the Kraken that they have that many picks over the next few years in specifically those 2 rounds of the draft. But I'll go over that in a little bit more detail once the trade deadline has come and gone, so we know for sure that Francis isn't going to make any more trades before Monday is over, with that video coming out either Tuesday or Wednesday, so be on the lookout for that. Okay, here it is Monday morning, and I was sitting down to start editing this video. The Kraken have already made one more trade as they send Marcus Johansen to the Washington Capitals in return for a 2022 4th, a 2023 6th, and Dylan Sprong, which, yeah, pretty good return there for Johansen, at least as far as first impressions are concerned. Also worth mentioning that with Daniel Sprong coming back in return for Johansen as a part of this trade, he becomes the first ever player acquired via trade by the Seattle Kraken in franchise history. And real quick, just to give a little bit more of a background on Sprong specifically, and I will go over this a little bit more in the full recap video of the trade deadline. Sprong is just having turned 25, a former second round pick having been picked by the Pittsburgh Penguins in the second round of the 2015 entry draft. He has already played in at least part of 6 different NHL seasons where he has kind of bounced around a little bit and had a hard time catching on in the NHL, but still has been a contributing player to some extent here for the Capitals in this season, where so far this season he has 14 points with 8 goals and 6 assists in 47 games played, and is coming off of his best season so far to this point in his career last year, where he had 20 points on 13 goals and 7 assists in 42 games. So yeah, a pretty decent and relatively young player that the Kraken get back that could be a part of this team going forward, but is also set to be an RFA here at the end of the season, so very well could end up leaving in free agency as well. Either way, a decent return for the Kraken, even just with those 2 draft picks for Johansen. And of course, if you haven't shared them already, I'd love to hear what you guys thought of these trades the Kraken have made so far down in the comment section. Initial thoughts, or maybe how your opinions changed on them as time went on. Again, at least as far as I'm concerned, initial reactions, that Järnkrok trade we kind of already mentioned in that R&R after it happened, but great return from the Kraken there. A bit of an underwhelming return, certainly, from the Gio and Blackwell trade. Disappointing, especially that we lose Blackwell and that line with Gordon Appleton. Appleton as well gets a bit of a disappointing return with just a 4th. Lauzon, though, a 2nd round pick, once again, a very pleasant surprise. If you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that help support the channel, so I'd appreciate you using them. And until next time, which will probably be pretty soon, stay safe out there, be good to each other, and go Kraken.